My talk title is quite apt, actually, considering that I stepped in for a speaker that had dropped out, so I only knew that I was going to be talking here a week ago. So we'll see how it goes. How does this make you feel? Like nothing. A blank page. Is it an exciting canvas brimming with endless possibilities? Or are you more like me? Is it mildly terrifying? So getting started can be hard, as you just saw. Possibilities can stretch out infinitely in front of you until your palms get a bit sweaty and your brain fills with static, and before you know it, you're alphabetizing your spice rack or endlessly scrolling through cat videos on Instagram. We have a term for it, writer's block. But it's not just writers that feel the pressure of a blank page. So I've always loved to draw, and when I was little, I drew non-stop. But when I started school, I started to doubt myself. I was more concerned with how good my drawings were and whether I was doing them properly. I started drawing a lot less. I'd stare at a blank page, and I wouldn't know where to start. Luckily for me, my mum saw this, and she started what we called the Scribble game. There we go. So my mum would draw a scribble on the page. It was just a scribble, nothing fancy, but then she'd hand me the pen, and she'd say that I had to make it into something. And it worked. With just a little pen stroke, the fear of the blank page was gone. The scribble provided a limitation and a challenge, a place to start and something to achieve. So Austin Kleon uses what he's termed blackout poetry to overcome his writer's block. Rather than staring down a blank page waiting for inspiration, he starts with a newspaper. He then takes a marker, and then bit by bit, he blacks out sections until a story emerges. It's like poetry by subtraction. Ernest Hemingway also famously used constraints to break through his writer's block. In his book, A Movable Feast, he writes, "Sometimes when I was starting a new story and I couldn't get it going, I'd sit in front of the fire and squeeze the peel of the little oranges into the edge of the flame and watch the sputter of blue that they made. I'd think, don't worry, you've always written before and you will write now. All you have to do is write one true sentence. Write the truest sentence that you know." So some of these sentences evolved into novels. Some found their way into his collection of short stories, and one of these sentences became famed as the world's shortest story. In only 6 words, it manages to tell a whole heartbreaking tale. So this influenced numerous attempts to create a story within a tight character limit, and it's credited to the birth of a genre called flash fiction. One of my favorite authors, Jeff Noon, he used to post amazing flash fiction on Twitter that he called microspores. And unfortunately, he stopped once they put the character limit up from 140 to 280 because it just wasn't enough of a challenge. So I don't write flash fiction or make blackout poetry or play the Scribble game with my mum anymore. My creative outlet is coding, specifically web animation. And I spend a lot of my time making things on CodePen. If you don't know about CodePen, CodePen is a place to write and share front-end code. It's like a playground for front-end developers. You can create pens which allow you to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in one interface right in the browser, and you get a real-time preview, and you get to save a showcase of your work, like this. And you can use CodePen to learn new things by tinkering, to try out new web technologies for the first time, and to browse through what other people have made and see how they've made it. So this is now my blank page. And in a pen, you get 3 panels, one for your HTML, one for your CSS, and one for your JavaScript. And when I initially started making things on CodePen, I decided to try and see what I could make without touching the JavaScript panel. So I made this demo with SVG filters and some SVG masking, and then stacked CSS transforms for the animation. It's not performant. It will make your laptop sound like it's going to explode. But it's really fun seeing how much you can achieve without reaching for JavaScript or an animation library. And there's a lot of really impressive CSS-only work out there. So Diana Smith makes particularly intricate oil paintings just with CSS. And she has a few rules. All elements must be typed out by hand. Only text editor and Chrome DevTools are allowed. And she allows herself use of SVG in really tricky circumstances, but it's limited, and shapes can only use hand-plotted coordinates and Bezier curves without the aid of any graphics editor. We should all quit and go home now. Yeah, it's particularly fun in Internet Explorer. I like it. It's like unintentional cubism. And another great CSS-only demo comes from Nathan Taylor. Now, there's limited ways that you can track user interactions with CSS, one of them being the hover pseudoclass. So you usually see this in action when you hover over a link and it changes color. And he's taken advantage of this simple selector to create this crazy platform game. So this was the first time I'd seen a game made using just CSS. And at the time, I was making a falling objects game at work for a recycling campaign with JavaScript. And this game was taking advantage of an animation library called GreenSock. It had levels and scores and all sorts of things. And I decided that I wanted to remake it with CSS. But yeah, this game was a little bit more complex. I had to keep track of a score. But it turns out you can actually do that with CSS. So the falling objects that you're about to see here are actually checkboxes. And then I'm using CSS counters to keep track of the score. Yes. Come on. Woo. Yeah. Crowd goes wild. So the best thing about this is that under the hood, there's only a few lines of CSS making this work. And I've popped that into a CodePen, and I've linked to it in the slides. So after this, you can all go away and make a CSS-only game. Great. So this is all the code that you need to keep track of a score in CSS. So on the left over there are checkboxes. And on the right is where the magic happens. So the first thing that you need to do is instantiate a counter on a section with counter reset. And the value for counter increment and counter reset can be the same. Have to be the same, but they can be anything you want. I've called it game because I'm super creative, but you can use whatever word you want. And game is the variable that keeps track of our score. And now checkboxes have a global attribute of checked that can be altered without any JavaScript just by clicking on them. And then we use this alongside counter increment to change the value that's held in the game variable. So basically, when we click on good object, we're adding 2. And when we click on bad object, minusing 1. And then to finish it up, we can display the value by using a pseudo element and the content property. It's like magic. Yeah. So it's not just all colorful blobs and games, though. There's things that I've learned by making CSS-only things in CodePen that have actually helped me write production code. When you restrict yourself to a limited toolset, you inevitably delve deeper into it. You get to learn its quirks and its lesser-known features. And knowing the limitations of something that you're working with makes you more able to make judgment calls on when you should reach for a different language, different library, or framework to solve the problem, rather than just bashing away at the problem like this chap. So I was recently working on this website for UX London, and we wanted to add subtle animation in with the background graphics as the user scrolled the page. It's very subtle. You can kind of see it. So I avoided having to use JavaScript to hook into scroll events or intersection observer by making use of hover. So each of the big slabs are actually actually have a hover state, which is triggering the CSS animations in the background. So it feels like the animations are being triggered by scroll, but with less of a performance hit. So yeah, this was self-imposed, but occasionally I've been in situations where using just CSS was a necessity. At my previous job, I made banner ads. You probably didn't see them. Depressing but true. So banner ads come with a few constraints already. There's always a size constraint, both in terms of dimensions and size in kilobytes, and a time constraint to work within. They're usually about 30 seconds long. And most ad-serving platforms now allow you to use Google CDN-hosted animation libraries like GreenSock. But when I was making these ads, GreenSock wasn't yet on Google CDN, and AdWords didn't allow you to use external JavaScript. Hey. And we had made this video animation for Goldsmiths University, and they wanted to use this across all of their ad placements. So this was fine for the ad placements that they bought that supported video. But some of them were AdWords and didn't support video or allow JavaScript. So I rolled up my sleeves and I got stuck into some CSS. I got really stuck in, completely lost track of time, and ended up with about 5,000 lines of keyframes. Yeah, I hadn't quite discovered SAS at this point. I don't recommend anyone tries this at home. So this was the final product. So disclaimer, this is using CSS clip path, which isn't supported in Internet Explorer, Edge, or Opera Mini. We served a backup image for those, and we just went ahead with it anyway, but it is experimental. It's using transforms for the movement, though, so on browsers that support clip path, the performance is actually really good. So in the HTML over there, I stacked a couple of images on top of each other, and then I used clip path to chop out sections of the image and then transform them horizontally from side to side to create the glitch effect. And behind the scenes, it's a steps timing function, which is giving it the stilted feel. Steps is a type of ease. In CSS, we call this ease a timing function because we like to make things confusing. But it specifies the number of steps between the first state and the end state of an animation. And it's also really good for making animated sprites. So I've slowed it down a little bit here so you can see what's going on behind the scenes. So the best thing about this project, other than feeling like a bit of a CSS wizard, was how involved I got and how much fun I had. Completely lost myself in the 5,000 keyframes, and I learned so much about CSS animation in the process. And finding ways to make learning more fun is pretty important to me, as I organize and coach at CodeBar Brighton. Shameless plug. CodeBar is a weekly non-profit workshop offering free programming help to people from groups that are underrepresented in the tech industry. It's every Tuesday in Brighton, and Bytes Conf actually gave us all of the money last year. It was great. Thank you very much. So we often get feedback from students that learning to code can be pretty overwhelming. We can just watch this GIF for the rest of the night, honestly. I'm fine with that. That's okay. Yeah, so especially if you're like me and this puppy and you get distracted easily. So there's so many different libraries and frameworks and languages and different ways to accomplish things. And when it comes time to actually sit down and learn something new, the amount of options can feel absolutely paralyzing. To a point, CodeBar can help with this. When students first start attending, they work their way through tutorials, and the tutorials themselves provide structure and focus. But the problem comes when students move on from the structure of tutorials. At this point, we encourage them to explore what they've learned by working on a personal project. And figuring out where to start is really hard. Often giving students a limitation can be really helpful. It's this slide again. So if, like me and the CodeBar students, you find a blank page mildly terrifying and would like some help getting started, here's some jumping off points. I often start with suggesting a theme. CodePen challenges are great for this. You can subscribe on the website and you get weekly challenges right into your inbox. In the time that I've been doing CodePen challenges, they've had all sorts of themes, from animals and shapes to more practical stuff like typesetting blog posts and recreating retro games like Pong. My favorite was the Pac-Man challenge. And the lovely folks at CodePen don't just give you a theme, they also provide some ideas and recommended resources. And then when the challenge gets going, they collate all the pens so you can check out what other people are making and get inspired. You can also fork pens. So if you see something that you like and you want to kind of figure out what's going on, you can fork it and play around with the codes. It's a really great way to learn. CodeVember is also another really great one. The goal with CodeVember is to build a creative piece of code every day of November. And they give you a daily keyword, and they also collate the entries like CodePen challenges. So when I was attempting CodeVember, one of my colleagues, a copywriter, actually joined in. She took the daily keyword and used it to inspire a short bit of writing each day. So it's worth checking out even if you don't code. CodeVember also hammered home, for me, the importance of another very useful constraint. We could look at this. This is pretty cool. We're going to go on to the next slide. Time constraints. Trying to bash out a piece of creative code every day is really hard. I was striving for perfection, and I was spending way too long on them, and it got pretty out of hand. I had to put a time limit on it in order to maintain my sanity. Having time to perfect something is great, but sometimes you just have to get started. Having too much time can be as immobilizing as a blank page. Without a time constraint, it's too easy to spend an eternity thinking and planning and getting nothing done. Now, the Pomodoro technique's famous for solving this procrastination problem. It encourages you to break your work into 25-minute intervals with a short break in between. Kind of similar, but slightly more panic-inducing than the Pomodoro technique is the most dangerous writing app. This is evil. You choose how long you'd like to write for, say 5 minutes or half an hour, and then you write non-stop until the clock runs out. Non-stop. If you pause at all, even for 5 seconds, it will write everything you just typed. It doesn't save it. If you're learning to code, playing with a specific library or API is also a really fun way to impose a constraint. I made this pen during CodeVember, prompted by that day's keyword of space, and it was one of my favorites. I used Mo.js to make the space dust. Mo.js is a really great little animation library. It's in beta. It's always been in beta. It's not being worked on anymore, so will always be in beta. But it is amazing. All the options are really beautiful out of the box, and you can do jazzy things like bursts and swirls with a couple of lines of code. It's really fun for playing around with. Character limits are also a really fun constraint. So Twitter is like the Twitter-based flash fiction of the programming world. You get 140 characters of JavaScript and a canvas to make something with. And there's some really mind-blowing work on there. I don't know how any of it works. It's terrifying. So pass the pen is also a really super fun way to make something creative within constraints. There was a game that I used to play when I was younger. You might have played it too. Someone would draw a head on the top of a piece of paper, and then they'd fold it over, and they'd pass it along to the next person, and they'd draw a torso, and then fold it over, and carry it on. This is like the web nerd version of that. So a theme gets picked, and someone starts off something in a CodePen, and then passes that along. Everyone gets a chance to add something. You can add whatever you want, but you're not allowed to change anyone else's code. And this one was space-themed. That's a recurring thing. Space themed. We ended up with a TARDIS. It's great. Yeah. This is the information about the Pass the Pen community, if anyone wants to check it out. So I think what I want to leave with you today is next time that you're trying to kick off a project or make something fun or learn something new and you don't know where to start, just start with a scribble. Thank you.